right, so I'm starting 3ds Max, and as that comes up, I want to run a question past everybody. So I'd like to know, yes or no, do you know what a lathe is? Lathe, Lathe. Who knows what a lathe is? Stop sharing this for a minute. Oh, okay, of course I haven't voted because. So here's our results of what a lathe is. For those of you who don't know what a lathe is, I'm going to just run a quick demonstration because this is foundational in our completion of this activity, is to understand what a lathe is. So as this video pops up here. This is a lathe being used. What a lathe does is it spins a piece of material around the center, and it allows someone to be able to use a tool to cut away parts of the material. So this obviously is a chess piece, which relates very well to what we're doing. Now, what I want to emphasize here is look at the outline of the object that's being lathed and how the tool moves across it. I used one of these when I was in high school. It was in a machines class. I went to what they call vocational training back in the day too. It was like going to tech campus. What I actually studied included using these machines. So I've never turned a piece of wood myself. That's another material. For example, using chat gives me an idea of something that you might think it's made using a lathe in real life. Anybody have any ideas for anything that might be an example of something made? Table leg, correct. Sink handle, very possibly. Cups, possibly. I believe that baseball bats are made with picture frames could be. Typically, it's a rounded, longer piece of material that's used. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to where we have a side view and again lock into that angle. Now let's imagine that this is 3ds Max. How could we create this object? So I'm going to grab a print screen here. I'm going to start up Paint for a minute because it's easy to work with in this instance. I'm going to move my screen over so that we can actually see the lathe part. And what I want to talk about is called a lathe modifier. And a lathe modifier works from what we call a spline, which is similar to a line, but it provides a shape that can be turned into a 3D object. So let me go over this for a minute. If I were to draw a straight line showing where the center point is of this object, and now I can hold shift and it will lock this straight line in Paint. That also is true in 3ds Max. And when I click, I've created two ends of a straight line here. These ends are known as vertices. As you may remember from geometry, a set of points along two ends is a line. Now, what I can do with this is I could actually continue to add elements, and you can determine in 3ds Max whether it's a hard line or if it's a smooth line. I'm going to switch over now to a smoother line, and I'm going to start to create some other data points. I shall use a pencil. And I'll just kind of show you what the shape of a pawn might look like. It's going to be rounded near the top. And let's make its thickness a little bit greater here. In fact, let's use an orange color for... So for a pawn, we would want it to be a little more circular here. But then the rest of the side could be almost the same. We would have basically the outline of it. This is the pattern which the tool is using when it creates this, takes this piece of material and turns it into a lathe piece of, in this instance, metal. Now what I've overdrawn here, and I need to correct my line a little bit, would be half of basically a piece of material that's been turned into a pawn. So what I want to do is I want to flip over to 3ds Max now for a minute. and I'm recording what I'm doing in 3ds Max, and I'm going to go through a similar process in 3ds Max. And let's see, by date, this one has been mocked up from what? Wow, I don't even know if this one's going to open up. I've also got a file here called Starting Point that's even older. This is a standard tutorial. Almost anybody that goes through and learns 3ds Max or any 3D modeling is probably going to be facing at some point a challenge of how to take something that's relatively rounded, or in fact made from a piece of rounded stock, and create something else out of it. Just going to take a look in Lab since I can't see what's going on. And some people are in 3ds Max. Now, there's a couple of concepts in here that are important to understand. Yeah, I don't know if this is really my scene or not. Obsolete data format. Yeah, I can see what this is an obsolete data format. Actually, yeah, this is a terrible example from 2015 so I'm just going to recreate a new one for you. If I can toggle over to 3ds Max for us. There it is. All right, so in 3ds Max, which I've got set to English, thankfully. Always worried I'm going to start the wrong version. I'm just going to set up a line. Now, before I create my line, and this is very important, it's in the instructions from yesterday, you want to make sure you're in an orthographic viewport. So an orthographic viewport means you're locked on and you're not going to be able to change your angle. If I start drawing points in a non-orthographic viewpoint, they can be anywhere in 3D space. If you see my hands right now, they're kind of moving around and they're not locked to a given plane. And that really becomes a problem when you add that third point. Because if the third point's not in line in some way with the other 2 points, we're going to end up with a very odd shape that will only look correct from one angle. So one thing is, the concept here is you want an orthographic viewport. Now those are not limited to, but they do include front, left, top. Those are 3 options for you that are very handy because there is shortcuts for them. Second concept we're talking about here, which I just mentioned before, is the lathe modifier, which in order to use, we're going to be using shapes. And in effect, we're going to create our own shape using lines. And within lines, I want you to understand that there are corners and there are curves. And while I'm not going to use them in this project, there's also Bezier, gives you handles to change your angles. You can do a lot with this. We're just going to focus on making a lathe. The fourth major outcome from this is that I want you to learn to use a reference image. A reference image is like, for example, if I asked you if you would recognize Mickey Mouse, so let's go with that. Who online do you thinks they would recognize Mickey Mouse? Would you recognize Mickey Mouse if you saw Mickey Mouse? Who's the leader of the band who plays for you and me? All right, so overwhelmingly, people would recognize him. Now, if you had to draw Mickey Mouse from memory, and I've done this before with students, we would do it if we were all in person. I would provide a limited amount of time, and I'd have everyone draw Mickey Mouse. And people would be talking about what he looked like, and they would be trying to remember the specifics. And then we collect all those images, and we put them to the side, and then I provide reference images, meaning you have a variety of angles of Mickey Mouse to look at, and from that, create the image. The majority of the students, given the same amount of time plus a reference image, are much more satisfied, and the work demonstrates the accuracy. So we'll use reference images, which ironically Christian's mentioned a little bit earlier about working on this. We're going to use them in this project. So a couple of things about 3ds Max that are interesting. If you want to have a reference image, eventually we'll work on what's called a virtual studio. We'll get to that later. But what you can do is you can put an image on a piece of geometry as though it's a material. So I'm going to grab a box in this instance, and I'm going to create a box in my 3D space. I'm locking to the grid when I click in this area, and I've just created a box, purple box. But in order to use it as a reference image, I want to put a picture on it. So if I drag a picture in from my File Explorer, it will ask me a number of options like, do you want to make this, run up my File Explorer here. It's the wrong thing for the File Explorer, Mr. Judge. There we go. Let's look at extra large icons here. So here's some reference images, and in particular, here's a pawn. It's probably a 3D rendering. Here's another pawn that was done using an outline. Here's an example of student work where they've got their name in here. And the instructions here refer to this image here called reference chess, which has all the chess pieces. So with this highlighted, if I were to drag that image into 3ds Max, it would allow me to put it into as a background or as an environment map. This can be tricky because it's going to make it feel like you can use that as a reference image, but it's the wrong way to do it. So I'm going to cancel that. What I want you to do instead is set up a material. So by touching M on the keyboard, I can just use a standard material. Now, if you're not familiar with standard materials, they're different than physically based materials. And if you look under General, you're going to see Physical, and down, where's the standard material? I think it's under Scanline. It's called Standard. Standard material will work fine. Standard material could just have a color with it. I'm going to double click on this and change the name of it to Chess Piece Reference. That's just so everybody knows what it is. I could just call it chess. Now what I want to do is out of the diffuse color, I'm going to click on this node. Watch please as I do this. I'm going to click on this node, and as I drag it out, now this is on the left side, which is the input side. It's going to say, what do you want to put here? So it's almost like I'm clicking on the word maps on the left-hand side, but it's kind of a shortcut. And I'm going to say bitmap. And it says, which bitmap? Well, I know what it is, and if you have it downloaded, you can get to it easily. Otherwise, it's on the game programming drive in this location. This is another neat trick. I'm going to copy this path by right-clicking and do copy. And in 3ds Max, in this browse button, I'm just going to paste this path. When I hit enter, it's going to go right to that area. I can make this extra large icons. There's 2 different versions. This one's got different colors to it. I think I started down the path of using this one, so I'm going to stick with it. And here's a third thing about this process that you want to be aware of. If you know what the size of this object is, it will make it much easier to have your proportions set up. Big heads up, pro tip. 3ds Max is going to invert your X and Y between what the browser properties show on your File Explorer and what the geometry should be to map it one-to-one. So sometimes I get a piece of paper and a pencil and I write these values down. But what I want to do is expose what is the actual size of this image. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to go to properties here. And I see under details what the size is. It's 312 by 152. With this in view, I can't get in here and change my length and width. So I have to kind of store this some way. So if I click on the dimensions and I get that recorded somewhere in a notebook, I can bring up a sticky note and I can just, there we go. This is from the last time I used it. So my chess reference. And I'm going to put them in the same order that they're there. It's 382, really odd size, by 152. I was online yesterday and somebody was doing this in lab, and I watched what they did, and I'm like, yeah, you got to change the X and Y. I was there, happened to be online looking at the lab at the time. And I don't know who it was because I didn't look at the user ID. So now that I know what the size is, I'm going to go ahead and do open. And I've got this pumped in where I can use this material and assign it to something like the box. Before I do, and this can be done easily on a standard material, I'm going to click on two-sided right here and make it a two-sided material, which will make it easier for me to work with. Now, in addition to the diffuse color, optionally connected to the ambient and the specular. Oh no, specular is going to be like white. That's fine. This is fine. Self-illumination you could set up as well, but not necessary, so I'm not going to overly complicate it. Now I've got an output node on the right, so watch this one. This pin's on the right, and I'm going to click and drag a wire from here to an object. This will assign the material to the object, but it's not yet been set to show in the viewport. To do so, within the material browser, there's a button up here that says show the shaded material in the viewport. And when I activate that, I will see that image as a material on the box. Could be a plane as well. So to illustrate that, I'm going to come in here and create a different object on the create panel, and I'm going to use a plane. And I'm going to just draw a plane out here, not worrying about the size. And I'm going to also apply that material to a plane. I'm also going to apply this material to a sphere. And I'm going to apply the same material to, I don't know, just something random, a teapot. So my material here, in order to be usable as a reference image, should be on something that I can use as a still background. So a sphere and a teapot are not good candidates. Just want to show you that a material can be applied to a 3D object that's non-uniform, as well as something that is uniform. Now, by looking at the properties on the plane here, so I'm going to switch to my W for move and select, and I'm going to click on the plane, and I want to look at what the properties are. I'm going to go to the modify panel. On the modify panel, I can see the length and width. And if I return to my sticky note for my numbers, and I were to follow these numbers, I guess you have to remember 382 and 152. If I put in 382 and 152 here, 382 centimeters. Even though the numbers match, the aspect ratio is reversed, which is really weird. So, pro tip, make sure you put them in opposite order. 152 by, 382, I think it was. And now I've got a reference plane that matches. Now, I brought up a box initially. I'll show you the power of using a box after we do the jet today, which is a super cool project. So I'm going to get rid of these other objects here. And what I just did is I created a reference plane that I can use to model against. I'm just going to kind of put it in the middle. In fact, as I do so, I'm going to point out that down here, as I move it, watch at the bottom of the screen, just below, just to the side here. Watch the numbers here. As I move this value around, the X value changes, the Y value changes, or the Z value changes. If you want to center it in your world, the trick is to right-click with your mouse on these spots. And you can right-click to move it to 0, 0, 0. And you got it locked in the center of your world. This is important if you're going to export your items because you want to have it its pivot point, its center point, right in the middle of the coordinate system. That's how it stores the data, so that when you bring it into another product like your game engine, it's on center and not like off to the side and causes extra challenges. Now that I have this set in my viewport, if I switch to the top viewport, and for now I'm done with my material browser, so I'm going to minimize that. And I'm going to switch to a top viewport, which there is, and I'm going to change my wireframe view to show default shading. Now I can see my object. Public chat's fired up. Let's see what's going on. Can't find the standard material. Sorry. Guys, feel free to open up your mic if you need to get my attention. I didn't hear that question that was being asked. So what you want to do is touch M on the keyboard to bring up the material browser. And I'm going to maximize this a little bit more. You should see under materials that which you can collapse by hitting on the plus or the minus, a category called general, and then one called scan line. So if I collapse general and I just focus on scan line, I should see advanced lighting, architectural, ray trace, and standard. So that's where you should find standard. If you can't find it there, click right here and type in the word standard. And you should find standard by the time you type ST. There is no scan line. Okay. In that case, you could grab, and you'll have to tell me what computer you're working on so I can look at that in detail. In that case, you could grab a different material, such as a physical material. And if you double click on that and rename it another version, whatever you want to call it, I'm going to call it blah, so I can see it. You'll notice that you have slightly different words here: base weight color map, etc. First, I'm going to pick a starting point like satin paint, and I'm going to pull off of what is almost the same thing, the base color map. And in there, hopefully you can find bitmap. Go to the same spot, grab the same object, and you'll see this. That's basically all you need to do right there. And then you could actually assign this material to an object similarly, making sure that you clicked on show it in viewport. So you could use a physical material, but the problem I have with physical material, I don't know how to make it double-sided. It's not as easy in my mind to make it double-sided, because I learned once upon a time, oh yeah, physical material. So how could I do it double-sided? There's got to be a way to do it. It's not essential to this process, so at least we got Chris going. Thank you, Chris, 13. Now I'm going to go back to my original, actually it doesn't matter, I'll stick with this material. And in the top viewport here, I've selected my plane. And this by the way, is a walkthrough of what was assigned for Wednesday. I'm going to touch, in the corner here, there's a button to maximize the viewport on my selection. It's this button here. If I click and hold it, make sure it's the turquoise or colored in version. And now I can see my selection. To give myself the most room to work, I'm also going to use the button in the corner here, the very far corner, to maximize the viewport. All of that was set up. All of that was so that I can use this as a reference image to create my pawn, which is in this corner over here. There were other images available. I just grabbed this one. And now what I'm going to use is use the middle mouse button to kind of pan over, and I'm going to scroll in using my wheel to focus on the actual shape of the pawn. So at this point, I'm ready to actually start to create my shape. The shape I'm going to create is not a primitive 3D model. So when I go to my Create panel at the top here, I will be on the plus, but instead of it being on the round shape, which is your geometry, I'm going to switch over to Shapes, and I'm going to select the thing that's called a line. So that's like right there, it says line. So I'm going to click on line, and I'm in a create new, that's been there. I can do auto grid, which will help me to snap things. And I want to make sure that I'm locked in a top viewport, which is one of the orthographic views. So now I'm on the create panel, and my mouse is like, we're ready to create points. And so the first point I want to do is I want to line up with the center of my object. Now I could start at the top, or I could start at the bottom, but thinking back to what we were looking at in our reference image, we're basically going to divide the shape in half. So I like to start on the bottom, and I just start to put my starting point because this area is where I'm used to connecting to my stock into an actual, in real life. There's actually like pinching things that are holding this in place so that as it spins, it's called a chuck. And so when you chuck your piece of material in here, it holds on to it. So if you looked inside here, you'd see that this less shiny material extends in here, and the chucks, which actually physically are putting the pressure on it, are actually more realistically right there. They don't extend on the outside. I was just trying to do a cutaway view, and I was off by a little bit. All right, here's what we're going to do now is we're going to start to create these points. When I make my first point, I'm going to hold the Shift key, just like I did in 3ds Max, which locks me onto that angle. If I don't, I can go all wiggly off on weird angles. In this case, I want to hold Shift and come to the very top and click to create a second point. This point we're going to come back to. It's a very important vector. And now, just following one side, and I've just arbitrarily picked the right side. I'm going to just follow along and trace the outline of the shape. Don't worry about perfection. I know you're on a Chromebook. I know you might not even have a mouse. So let me know if this is exceptionally challenging. And, I just want you to get the concept here. Now, as I create these vertices, I'm going to try to finish off about the same spot. And then on the very last click, you want to overlap to a point that you see this prompt right here. Close spline. Now, you'll notice when I said create, I said I'm going to create a line. This last vector being created at the same point on the same 3D space, it initiates this prompt, which says, do you want to actually make this a closed shape, a spline? And I'm going to answer yes. That's the outline, but it hasn't become a 3D object yet. We're going to use a modifier to do this, so that we actually can expose the details of the line. I'm going to switch now to the modify panel, which again is what looks like a bent bar. And I can see that I've got an area that can be opened up, a line, which has got the little triangle next to it, can be opened up to look at the details of it. And you'll know I threw out the word vert a couple of times. So when I select the vertices at that level in the stack, in the viewport, I see the points have been exposed. Now, because the point of origin was down here, I could click on this point to select it, and I can add a lathe operator, which is a modifier. So first I had to expose the points, not the spline, but get to this, and now I'm going to add a modifier. If I go to the top up here, again, the modify panel, I've got a modifier list. When I click in there, I can touch L on the keyboard, and you'll see lathe is the first option that comes up. If I select the lathe operator, it instantly turns it into a 3D object. Lo and behold, because of the fact I traced the shape, I can now see the outline of the object. If I hold down Shift and press Q, do a quick render, happen to pop up on the other screen, there's a render of the object. That's all I wanted you to do yesterday. There was a lot of background information, and then to add your name and turn in a render. Now, just like we did with the animals, you could make multiple copies of this. If I hold down Shift and drag, it'll say, do you want to make copies, or I'll make them instances, and I'll call them pawns. If I remember correctly, in a chessboard, you might want to have a total of 8 pawns. So if I just put in 7, it's going to create a total of 8 pawns for me. Now, this is not something that I'm looking for quality modeling. It's the application of the process. So there's a view from the top. There's a view from the side. So a couple of these here. And I'm just orienting these at more interesting angles. Switch to using W, I'm going to switch to the move mode. And I'm just setting up a scene that shows that I've got some pawn pieces here. And I've separated them away from the reference image. You could even show the very bottom if you wanted to. Just using W and E at this point. Don't worry about prettying up anything that looks a little bit odd here, considering it's more or less a speed run, just to demonstrate how a lathe works. It's perfectly acceptable. All right. And when we get into materials, this is an example of a scene where you might want to change up the materials a little bit later. We can talk about smoothing it, etc. But at this point, I want to see this. I'm going to add my name, which I'm going to go to the Create panel.
9 o'clock a.m., 71 degrees Fahrenheit.
And using the text, I'm going to create. Whoa, that's too huge. Control Z. I should probably make my size about 20. And then in max text, I'm just going to put in student, create my text, and I need to add a modifier to add depth to it. Some of you have been using what I call the cop-out by doing, there's a text plus primitive, but I'm used to doing the modifier on my text. Bevel, for example, I'm going to do rather than extrude because I can make it look a little fancier. A couple of segments and bring my first level out by few. Whoa. Yeah, that's fine. I got to get the really small values. And now if I do a render with Shift Q, there's my name, there's my pawns, save the image, turn it in, we're done. So the reason I'm doing the demo and recording it is so that you can go back and you can replay the demo. It's not intended for you to follow along at the exact same time. So don't sweat that. When it is recorded, Schoology's up for 7 days. You can use the scrub bar there. YouTube is going to be out there, as far as I know, forever. So